I experienced this back in the 90s when me and my friend Mark decided to go to a camping spot near a national forest here in Indiana. It was only my second time camping, while Mark had probably done it multiple times already. Needless to say, Mark was well versed in the ins and outs of camping, so I trusted him a lot. We were still in our 20s back then, so camping was a really cool concept for us. So off we went to the area around 12 p.m. It was a long hike and an even longer drive before we reached the foothills of the forest. We arrived there around 2 p.m. We started walking, taking it slow to ensure safety and avoid injury since we had a lot of gear with us, along with food and water. Around 4 p.m. we found a nice spot, and the place was noticeably quiet. We didn't encounter or see any other campers around. The spot we found had traces of a previous bonfire, so it seemed like a good spot since many others had camped there before. I helped Mark set up our tent. We each had one, so there were 2 tents set up. Probably took us about 30 minutes to set up the tent because it was newly bought and we weren't familiar with setting it up properly at the actual campsite. After that, we started making a bonfire to fix our dinner since the weather was getting colder as it was starting to get dark. While I was rummaging through our food bag, we noticed that the wood in the bonfire burned quickly. So Mark said he would look for more firewood nearby while it was still early so the fire wouldn't die out. I said okay, and I started preparing our dinner. Mark headed to the right side of our campsite to look for firewood. He had his flashlight so I could see where he was going. After about 5 minutes, he was still there, and I thought he might be taking longer because he was cutting some thick branches, and I could hear the cracking of twigs as he cut them. While I was opening a can, I heard footsteps coming from the left side of our campsite. At first, it was faint, and I didn't notice it right away since I was focused on opening the can in the dim light. Then the footsteps grew slightly louder, as if someone was walking on dry leaves. At that point, I turned on my flashlight and aimed it towards the direction of the sound, but I didn't see anyone or anything that could be making those footsteps. A little later, I saw Mark coming back with a lot of firewood. I told Mark about what I heard, and he said that kind of sound was normal when camping. It could just be animals like squirrels or dry branches moving in the air up in the trees. Since I wasn't very knowledgeable about camping yet, I just brushed it off and focused on fixing the food. While Mark and I were eating, he started telling me various experiences of some of the campers he had been with, most of which were terrifying, so my fear started to build up again during those hours. Especially when he recounted the experience of one of his buddy who supposedly camped in an old abandoned church in Vietnam, located in an isolated area, where they heard ghostly voices of a child and a woman, as if they were crying, and they heard it at 2 in the morning. Later that evening, around 11 p.m., we decided to rest in our respective tents. I did my best to shake off the fear, but every sound of twigs and rustling of leaves nearby only heightened it. I couldn't sleep well, accompanied by the cold, so I was still awake until 1 in the morning, while Mark seemed fast asleep. Later on, I heard him cough, thinking he woke up, but he seemed to have fallen asleep again. I'm planning to go out to pee, but I couldn't bring myself to do it because I was alone and really scared. Around 2 a.m., all the hair on my body stood up when I heard a gentle but mortifying laughter of a woman outside. I didn't know where the laughter was coming from, but I knew it was near our campsite. My whole body stiffened with fear. That woman's laughter was really chilling. Later on, I heard the footsteps again, but this time, it was near my head. I didn't move, and I felt that Mark was still not waking up, so I became even more afraid. I heard those footsteps around my tent, but as a man, I gathered my courage and thought of suddenly getting up and unzipping the tent to see who was outside. When I got up, the footsteps suddenly disappeared, and I didn't see anyone outside, and the surroundings were eerily quiet. No matter where I pointed the flashlight, I couldn't see anyone. At that point, I quickly woke up Mark, who was actually already awake and also frozen with fear, as if having a panic attack. He said he also heard the laughter earlier and was just waiting for me to wake up because he was also scared to check it alone. At that point, we turned on all the lights we had, small or large, and lit the bonfire again. We agreed not to leave until daylight because we didn't know where that person had gone, and we might be in danger if we walked around at that time. Until morning came, we didn't hear or see those sounds again. What was even more chilling was that we didn't see any footprints around our tent except for ours. I also remembered that I didn't hear any footsteps of someone running away when I opened my tent to see who was outside. Until now, that's still one of the weirdest camping experiences we won't forget. We did many more camping trips after that, and thankfully we never encountered that kind of scenario again. But we never camped again in that spot, never again. Nothing brings more joy to a high school student's life, especially when you have friends who are reckless and carefree, willing to do any idea and gimmick that comes to their mind. In 2007, there were 5 of us friends, 2 Asian, 1 light-skinned, and 2 white. One of my clever white friend came up with the idea of camping in a spot he knew. He asked the 4 of us to come, and we immediately agreed because why not? There was nothing else to do on the weekend, and the area was close to where we lived. Although the area was isolated, it was still near national roads, and he said there used to be many houses and cabins there, but now they were abandoned, so it would be great to explore, especially since there were 5 of us, so what were we afraid of? It was Saturday. We agreed to meet at a parking spot near Walmart, and we used his ride. He also provided the camping gear, except for flashlights, of which we were supposed to have 1 each. Luckily, we had an Asian friend whose parents owned a snack shop, so he took care of our food for the camping trip. So, me and my other 2 friends just contributed our presence. We headed to the spot, laughing hysterically because it took us an hour to find a spot to park because there were ditches all along the roadside. Fortunately, we found a tight spot and parked there. We prayed and crossed our fingers that it wasn't private property because if it was, we really wouldn't know what to do. We got out of the car and started walking towards the spot. We moved slowly because of all the gear we were carrying. We were practically stumbling over each other, but luckily, it was still bright out, so we made it there on time. It was our first time camping, so the 2 Asians kept asking if there were bears there, but our friend who invited us said there weren't any. 3 of us spent 2 hours setting up the tent because we didn't know how, so we had to figure it out on the spot. Luckily, we managed to finish just in time to fix dinner, which was just noodles because most of what we brought was junk food and beer, which we snuck in. We rested for a while there, and luckily, there were plenty of twigs around the campsite, so we didn't have to worry about firewood. Around 6 p.m., my friend suggested that we go explore the abandoned houses. We had 1 flashlight each, so it was really bright. We first entered an abandoned 2-story house and laughed because there were many explicit magazines there, and we grabbed whatever caught our eye. We also saw lots of neatly folded clothes, which was weird because the place was abandoned. We then entered another house about 100 meters away from the first one. When we entered, we were shocked because it smelled like cigarette inside. At that point, we fell silent. We listened to every rustle we could hear outside and inside the house. We slowly peeked into every corner of the house and saw empty noodle packs, cigarette butts, an ashtray, and we even saw a bed that looked like someone had been sleeping on it. At that point, we knew the place wasn't abandoned and someone was living there. It was either a homeless person or whoever owned the house was living there, and we just happened to catch them while they were away. I told my friends that we needed to slowly leave and turn off our flashlight until we were far from that house. As we left, we slowly moved away from the house and hid behind a big tree. Later on, we heard a faint cough from a man. We saw the man enter the house carrying a metal object that looked like a machete and turn on a dim light. Later on, the man came out and lit a cigarette, as if scanning the surroundings because he seemed to notice that someone had entered the house, which was us. Later on, the man entered the house again, so we quickly left and went back to our campsite. To our surprise, when we returned, our tents were torn apart as if someone had slashed them, and our backpack full of food was gone. But the other backpacks were still there, although they were all open and our stuff was scattered all over the place. We quickly packed up and left for the car. We were quiet and lost our playful demeanor. When we arrived at the car, we looked at each other and asked what had happened. Until now, we still talk about that creepy night. We were just thankful that we were not hurt, because if we had encountered that man face to face, we didn't know what would happen to him or to us. Since then, I've learned to be cautious at all times, and I'm sure they've learned the same from that experience. Since I was young, I've always loved camping. My friends and I used to do it in the backyard of our house, sometimes in theirs. As a teenager, I continued this hobby. I often invited my high school friends to camp out in various spots like the national forest and private properties, as long as we asked permission. But most of the time, I did it alone. In 2005, my grandfather bought a property in a rural area. It was a beautiful area, vast, quiet, and clean. Since then, whenever I had free time, I would camp there, finding a nice spot and settling in for the night. The area was also full of trees, giving off a national forest vibe or something. Besides the firing range in a nearby property, my grandfather's land had no issues. He said there used to be a farmstead there long ago. Anyway, it was beautiful, so it's not surprising that the land was already cultivated in the past. One weekend, I decided to camp there again. I bought a new hammock and a tent for 3 persons, so I was excited about this camping trip. I settled in at a spot where I had camped before, as it was the only spot suitable for my new tent, and it was also close to 2 adjacent trees where I could set up my hammock. My grandfather wasn't on the property because he and my grandmother had gone to Chicago to visit my aunt, so I was alone there. After setting up my tent and hammock, I rested for a while. Later, I started a fire and fixed my food. Everything was going as usual until it was time to sleep. In the middle of the night, it started drizzling. It was just a light drizzle at first, but then it turned into a heavy downpour. Luckily, the spot where I set up my tent was slightly elevated, so the bottom of the tent didn't get soaked. When the rain stopped, I heard footsteps outside my campsite. I peeked and shone my flashlight, but I didn't see anything, so I thought maybe I was just imagining things and went back to sleep. The next morning, as I opened my eyes, I was surprised to see that I hadn't properly closed the tent cover. Thankfully, I had closed the mesh, so no insects or anything had gotten inside. I thought I'd lie down for another 5 minutes before getting up, so I turned on my side. Then, as I was about to get up, I saw 2 kids crouching outside and looking at me through the mesh of the tent. I was startled, as I noticed that they were wearing old-fashioned clothes. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I knew they were curious about me. One of them scratched his leg, while the other pressed his palm against the mesh of my tent door. At that point, I quickly removed the blanket from my feet and hastily opened the tent. But when I did, I didn't see any kids outside. Whoever those 2 kids were, they had disappeared. They vanished so quickly, it hadn't even been 30 seconds since I last saw them. I couldn't see them anywhere, and it felt like they had just vanished into thin air. I don't know if I was just imagining things or if I was dreaming, but what I saw felt incredibly real. Until now, that remains one of the weirdest experiences I've had while camping. Nonetheless, I still camp out on that property until today, even now that I have children of my own. I just like to think that if those were ghosts I saw, it's okay because maybe they're just watching over the property that once belonged to them. My cousin Chris is fond of camping. He has invited me several times, but I always declined. However, this time, I agreed to join him, especially since I was having issues in my relationship with my girlfriend, and I also thought I needed to unwind because I was burnt out from work and dealing with some complicated matters. This happened in May 2012. We camped out in a forest near an abandoned community in an isolated area. According to Chris, there were still a few people living there, but it was okay because many campers also frequented the area where we would be staying. He had camped there several times with some friends, and he said I would like it there because it's quiet and there's a nearby spring at our campsite. He told me not to worry about the camping gear because he would take care of it. I just needed to bring food and water, and we would combine our food supplies later to have more and share. When we arrived at the spot, I immediately noticed that there were no people around, contrary to what he told me that many campers frequent the place. He was also puzzled, but nevertheless, we weren't bothered and proceeded to set up our gear, including tents for each of us and hammocks. Chris also lit a fire, and he taught me some tips on how to build a fire and which kind of wood branches catches fire easily and which ones don't. 2 hours later, while we were sitting in the hammock and chatting, he mentioned the history of the community near our camping site. He said many people used to live there, but for some unknown reason, they all left since the 80s. The abandoned community was not too far from our camping site, and we could see the entrance from where we were. Later on, we saw 2 cars enter the area, and we could see their headlights. The 2 cars stopped in front of the farthest building, which from what I saw earlier in the light seemed to be a church. We weren't worried because there were still people living there and they might be locals, so we just ignored it, and Chris eventually got sleepy and went into the tent to sleep. I told him I would stay up first because I wasn't sleepy yet due to drinking too much coffee since earlier, and I also wanted to contemplate for a while. While I was sitting in the hammock, I heard people talking from the area. The sound came from the church at the end. At that time, I was just listening to their conversation, but I couldn't understand much because the crickets were making noise too. Later on, the noise stopped and I felt cold, so I went into the tent. I also thought that the place seemed safe, so maybe I could sleep now, especially since it was already past midnight. In short, I dozed off, only to suddenly wake up because I heard rustling and footsteps outside the tent. But I thought it might just be Chris, who woke up and maybe sat in the hammock after checking the campsite, so I just ignored it, and later on I dozed off again, which wasn't a very deep sleep. After a few minutes, I heard someone coughing outside, and I also heard another set of footsteps to the left of our campsite. I woke up by that time because I knew something wasn't right. At that point, I called out to Chris 3 times, and whoever those people were outside our tent ran away. I immediately went out to check the surroundings. This time I had a weapon for self-defense. I quickly went to Chris's tent to check if he was there. He was fast asleep, and I woke him up to tell him what happened. He also woke up and turned on his flashlights. We were surprised by what we saw because the surroundings of our tents were surrounded by white powder, which I think was lime. It encircled our campsite as if the spot where our tents were set up was outlined. It was very weird and scary, and whoever did it, we didn't see them. We decided to pack up and leave that spot because it didn't feel safe anymore. Although we had weapons with us, we tried not to use them as long as we were safe. As we were about to leave, the 2 cars we saw earlier suddenly sped off from the abandoned community. Up to now, we still don't know who they were. What's even scarier is that some of the people living there seemed indifferent about the incident. Since then, we never returned and camped in that area again. I don't know about others if they still go there.